Jake Morrison had served in the Galactic Defense Fleet for 3 years. He was proud of his position as a lieutenant, proud to represent Earth among the stars. The alliance between his home planet and the Confederation of United Worlds had given humanity protection and a chance to explore beyond their solar system. Jake believed in the mission. He believed in the partnership. That belief died on a cold morning in the Outer Rim territories. His squadron had been running routine patrols near the border zones. These areas were dangerous, filled with pirates and hostile forces. The Confederation kept a presence there to protect trade routes and colony worlds. Jake flew a small fighter craft, one of 12 in the squadron. His commander was a Vorthan named Captain Zethara, a tall being with blue skin and 4 eyes who had decades of military experience. The patrol started normally. Jake checked his systems, communicated with his wingmen, and followed the flight path. Space looked peaceful. Stars dotted the darkness like diamonds on black cloth. Jake had learned to love these quiet moments between jumps. Then the sensors screamed warnings. A Krell warfleet had appeared from nowhere, dropping out of hyperspace right in front of them. Jake counted 15 heavy warships, each one bristling with weapons. The Krell were known across the galaxy as brutal warriors who showed no mercy. They conquered worlds and enslaved populations. Seeing their ships sent ice through Jake's veins, Captain Zethara gave immediate orders. The squadron would retreat. All ships were to jump to hyperspace and return to the nearest Confederation base. The plan was simple and smart. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Running was the only option. Jake prepared his jump drive. His fingers moved across the controls with practiced speed. Around him, other fighters were already vanishing into hyperspace. Leaving bright flashes of light as they escaped, the Krell ships opened fire. Energy beams cut through space. One of Jake's squadron mates exploded in a ball of flame before she could jump away. Jake's fighter shook violently. Alarms blared in his cockpit. A Krell beam had clipped his engine section. Red lights flashed across his display panel. His jump drive showed critical damage. The system was offline and wouldn't restart. He tried everything. He rerouted power, reset the computer, and followed every emergency procedure he had memorized. Nothing worked. The jump drive was dead. He was stuck in normal space while the Krell fleet moved closer. Jake opened his communication channel. "This is Lieutenant Morrison. My jump drive is damaged. I cannot jump. Requesting immediate assistance." Silence answered him for 3 long seconds. Then Captain Zethara's voice came through, cold and distant. "Lieutenant Morrison, we cannot risk the squadron for 1 damaged fighter. You are ordered to proceed to the nearest safe zone using normal engines. Good luck." The channel went dead. Jake watched in disbelief as the last 3 fighters in his squadron vanished into hyperspace. They left him alone. They abandoned him in hostile territory with a crippled ship, while Krell warships closed in from all sides. He wanted to scream. He wanted to curse them, but training took over. Jake shut down non-essential systems to conserve power. He angled his fighter toward a nearby asteroid field, hoping to hide among the rocks. His damaged engines could barely push the ship forward. The fighter limped through space like a wounded bird. The Krell found him within 2 hours. Their ships surrounded the asteroid field. There was no escape, nowhere to run, and no hope of rescue. Jake considered fighting. His weapons still worked. He could take a few of them with him before they destroyed his fighter. But something stopped him. If he died here, alone in space, no one would ever know what happened. The Confederation had already written him off. His death would be a footnote in some report. Jake decided he wanted to live. He wanted to survive and make sure everyone knew how the Confederation treated human soldiers. A Krell boarding ship attached to his fighter. Jake heard the metal screech as they cut through his hull. He stood up from his pilot seat and waited. The door tore open. 3 Krell warriors pushed inside. They were massive, standing over 7 feet tall with 4 powerful arms. Their skin looked like armored plates. They carried energy weapons that could vaporize a human in 1 shot. Jake raised his hand slowly. He had no weapon, No armor, and no chance in a fight. The Krell looked at him with what might have been amusement. One of them grabbed Jake with 2 arms and dragged him out of his fighter. They took him to their warship, a huge vessel called Devastator's Claw. The Krell threw Jake into a detention cell. The room was small and dark, with metal walls and a single glowing panel for light. A force field covered the door opening. Jake sat on the hard floor and tried to think. He knew the Krell reputation. They didn't ransom prisoners. They didn't trade captives for political gain. The Krell took prisoners for one reason only: entertainment. They would throw him into their combat arenas. They would make him fight their warriors for sport. When he died, they would laugh and find another victim. This was how the Krell had operated for thousands of years. Jake closed his eyes and controlled his breathing. Fear would not help him. Panic would not save him. He needed to think clearly. He was alone. Truly alone. For the first time in his life, no backup was coming. No rescue team would storm the ship. The Confederation had abandoned him. Earth was light years away and didn't even know he was captured. He had only himself, his training, his mind, his will to survive. Jake thought about his family back on Earth. His mother had cried when he joined the defense fleet. She worried he would die in space. Far from home, his father had been proud, shaking Jake's hand and telling him to serve with honor. His younger brother had been jealous, wanting to follow Jake into the stars. Would they ever know what happened to him? Would the Confederation even tell them he was missing? Or would Jake simply disappear, his name added to a list of casualties with no explanation? These thoughts made something hard form in Jake's chest. Anger. Cold, focused anger at the aliens who had left him behind. They saw humans as new to the galaxy, inexperienced and weak. They calculated that one human life was acceptable loss. They were wrong. Jake stood up and examined his cell carefully. The walls were solid. The Krell came for Jake on the 3rd day. 4 guards opened his cell and dragged him through the corridors of Devastator's Claw. Jake didn't resist. He saved his energy and watched everything. He memorized the turns, counted the doors, and noted where guards were stationed. Information was a weapon, and he collected every piece he could. They brought him to a massive chamber. The arena was larger than anything Jake had expected. The floor spread out like a small battlefield, filled with obstacles, barriers, and scattered weapons. Lights blazed down from above. Around the arena, hundreds of Krell warriors stood watching from elevated platforms. They wanted a show. At the center of the platform sat Warlord Kreshtar. The Krell commander was enormous, even among his own kind. Scars covered his armored skin. Weapons hung from his belt. He looked at Jake the way a cat might look at a mouse before playing with it. Kreshtar spoke in the common galactic language. His voice boomed across the arena. Human, you stand in the proving ground of Krell warriors. Here you will face our champions. Fight well and die with honor. Fight poorly and die in shame. Either way, you die. The Krell warriors cheered. They beat their weapons against their armor, creating a thundering rhythm that shook the air. Jake stood quietly in his prison clothes and looked around the arena. He saw clubs, staffs, and bladed weapons scattered among the obstacles. The Krell wanted to give their prey a chance. It made the hunt more interesting for them. A door on the opposite side of the arena opened. A young Krell warrior stepped out. His name was Veshkor. Though Jake didn't know that yet, the warrior wore ceremonial armor and carried 2 curved blades. He looked eager, excited for his chance to kill a human in front of the warlord. The crowd roared. Veshkor raised his weapons and charged. Jake ran. Not away from the warrior, but toward a stack of metal barriers. The Krell laughed. They thought the human was scared, trying to hide. They were wrong. Jake grabbed a metal staff from the ground as he ran past. He rolled behind a barrier just as Veshkor's blades cut through the air where Jake had been standing. The warrior was fast and strong. Direct combat would be suicide. Jake needed to be smarter. He used the barriers to block the warrior's view. He moved quickly, staying low and quiet. Veshkor hunted him through the obstacles, but Jake had already learned the layout of the arena. He led the warrior in circles, tired him out, and made him frustrated. When Veshkor swung his blade too hard and it stuck in a metal barrier, Jake struck. He swept the warrior's legs with his staff, knocking him down. Before Veshkor could recover, Jake brought the staff down hard on the warrior's head. Once, twice, 3 times. The ceremonial armor cracked. Veshkor stopped moving. The arena went silent. Jake stood over his first kill, breathing hard. The Krell warriors stared in shock. No one had expected the human to win. They thought it would be a quick execution. Instead, one of their young warriors lay dead on the arena floor. Warlord Kreshtar laughed. It was not a happy sound. The human has spirit. Send another warrior. The second Krell warrior was older and more experienced. He didn't charge blindly like Veshkor. He approached carefully with a heavy club and a shield. Jake switched tactics. He threw his staff at the warrior's face as a distraction, then grabbed one of Veshkor's dropped blades and went low. He slashed at the warrior's legs, the parts not protected by the shield. The fight lasted longer, but Jake adapted. He learned how the Krell moved. They were strong and tough, but they fought with pride and honor. They announced their attacks. They preferred direct confrontation. Jake had no pride to protect. He used every dirty trick he knew from combat training on Earth. He threw sand in eyes, struck at joints, and exploited every opening. The second warrior fell. Then a third entered the arena. Then a fourth. Each time, Jake learned more. He understood their fighting style better. He found new weapons among the arena equipment. A length of chain. A sharp piece of broken metal. Anything could be a weapon if used correctly. By the time the fifth warrior fell, something had changed in the crowd. The cheering stopped. The Krell warriors watched in silence now. Some looked angry. Others looked afraid. This human, this small, weak creature from a new species, was killing their trained fighters one after another. Warlord Kreshtar stood up. His entertainment had become something else. Something that challenged Krell's superiority. That could not be allowed. He spoke sharply to his guards. Enough. Return the human to his cell. We will execute him properly tomorrow. Guards flooded into the arena. They surrounded Jake carefully, keeping their weapons pointed at him. Jake didn't resist. He was exhausted. Blood covered his prison clothes, though most of it belonged to the Krell warriors. His body hurt from a dozen small wounds. But he had survived. He had won. They threw him back into his cell. Jake collapsed on the floor and allowed himself 5 minutes of rest. His muscles screamed in pain. His hands were cut and bruised. But his mind was clear and sharp. He had proven something important today. Humans could beat the Krell in combat, not through strength, but through adaptability and intelligence. As Jake rested, he thought about what came next. The Krell would execute him soon. They wouldn't risk another arena fight. They would simply shoot him or throw him out an airlock. He needed to escape before that happened. During his trip to and from the arena, Jake had memorized the ship's layout as best he could. He knew where guard stations were located. He had seen where they stored equipment. Most importantly, he had noticed something during the arena fights. The Krell weapons and armor had specific weak points. Their technology was advanced but designed for their 4-armed bodies. A human could use it differently. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He worked in the darkness of his cell, using a piece of sharp metal he had hidden in his clothes. The metal came from the arena, a small shard he had palmed when the guards weren't watching. He used it to carefully work at the control panel next to his cell door. The Krell technology was complex, but Jake had studied engineering. Jake lived in the walls of Devastator's Claw like a ghost. The ventilation shafts became his home. He learned every tunnel, every access point, and every route through the ship's hidden spaces. The Krell had built their warship for battle, not for security against someone inside. That was their first mistake. During the first week, Jake focused on survival. He found water pipes and tapped into them carefully. He stole food from storage areas, taking small amounts that wouldn't be noticed immediately. He found a quiet corner deep in the engineering section where he could rest for a few hours at a time. Sleep came in short bursts. He stayed alert always. The Krell hunted him constantly. Teams of warriors searched the ship, checking every room and corridor. But they were looking for someone hiding or running. They didn't understand that Jake had become part of the ship itself. He watched them through ventilation grates. He listened to their conversations. He learned their patrol patterns and schedules. On the 8th day, Jake started his campaign. It began small. He sabotaged a water recycling unit in one section of the ship. The breakdown seemed like normal equipment failure. Maintenance crews fixed it, grumbling about cheap parts. 3 days later, Jake sabotaged another unit in a different section. Then another. A pattern emerged, but the Krell couldn't connect it to the escaped human. Water shortages created stress among the crew. Warriors argued over rations. Tempers flared in the heat of the ship as cooling systems struggled without proper water flow. Jake moved to his next target. The food storage areas were heavily guarded, but Jake didn't need to enter them. He found the refrigeration control systems and altered the temperature settings, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to make food spoil faster. Within days, warriors were getting sick from contaminated meals. The medical bay filled with patients. Warlord Kreshtar ordered full ship sweeps. Hundreds of warriors searched every section, determined to find the human saboteur. Jake stayed one step ahead. He used the chaos he created as cover. While warriors searched the engineering decks, he was in the crew quarters. When they flooded the living areas, he was back in engineering. The Krell began to crack under the pressure. They saw threats everywhere. A noise in the ventilation shaft sent armed teams running. Shadows in dark corridors caused friendly fire incidents. Jake encouraged this paranoia with careful planning. He left small signs of his presence. A handprint in dust. A piece of torn cloth. Sounds in the darkness. One night, a Krell warrior named Greshnar stood guard duty alone in a dimly lit corridor. He heard something moving above him in the ceiling. He looked up and saw a ventilation grate slowly opening. Fear seized him. The human was coming. Greshnar fired his weapon wildly at the ceiling. Energy beams cut through metal and wiring. Sparks rained down. Other guards came running at the sound of weapons fire. They found Greshnar standing in the smoking corridor, shaking and pointing at the ceiling. But there was no human, just an empty ventilation shaft. Jake had been 3 corridors away when Greshnar opened fire. He had tied a wire to the grate and pulled it open remotely. The trick worked perfectly. Now the Krell were shooting at empty shafts, wasting ammunition, and exhausting themselves chasing nothing. The psychological warfare continued for 3 weeks. Jake knew he couldn't kill all the Krell warriors. There were too many, and he was just one man with improvised weapons. But he could break their morale. He could turn the ship into a prison of fear for them instead of him. Warriors stopped sleeping well. They jumped at sounds. They refused to walk dark corridors alone. Some started seeing the human in their dreams. A shadow creature that couldn't be killed. The legend grew with each passing day. Some Krell swore the human could walk through walls. Others claimed he could become invisible. A few believed he was already dead, but his ghost haunted the ship. The truth was simpler. Jake was exhausted, hungry, and running on pure determination. His body hurt constantly. Small wounds infected in the dirty ventilation shafts. He had lost weight and his prison clothes hung loose on his frame, but he kept going because stopping meant death. As long as he moved, as long as he fought, he was alive. Warlord Kreshtar's authority began to crumble. His warriors questioned his leadership. How could one human cause such destruction? Why couldn't they catch him? The warlord had promised them an easy victory and glorious battle. Instead, they were living in fear of shadows and spending their days chasing a ghost. Jake decided it was time to escalate. He had studied the ship's systems carefully over the weeks. He understood how the power grid worked, where critical systems were located, and what would cause the most damage. The engineering section became his target. Getting there was dangerous. Guards were stationed at every entrance after Jake's earlier sabotage. But he found another route through a maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the main engineering deck. It was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and filled with hot steam from coolant leaks. Jake crawled through it inch by inch, ignoring the burns on his skin. He emerged inside a storage room next to the main reactor chamber. Through the wall, he could hear the massive reactor humming with power. This was the heart of Devastator's claw. Without it, the ship was dead in space. Jake didn't plan to destroy the reactor. That would kill everyone, including him. But he could damage it enough to cripple the ship. He studied the plasma conduits that fed energy throughout the vessel. These were designed with safety systems that would shut down the reactor if anything went wrong. Jake needed to bypass those safety systems. He worked for 2 hours in the storage room, accessing the control panels and rerouting the safety protocols. Sweat poured down his face. His hands shook from exhaustion and hunger. But he kept working. This would be his final move. Either it would succeed, and he could escape in the chaos, or he would die trying. Alarms suddenly blared throughout the ship. Jake's heart jumped. Had they found him? But the alarms weren't security alerts. They were proximity warnings. Another ship had appeared on sensors. Jake accessed a nearby computer terminal and checked the display. A Krell reinforcement fleet had arrived, answering Warlord Kreshtar's earlier distress calls. 8 warships surrounded Devastator's claw. Kreshtar had called for help, something that brought him deep shame. But the situation had become too desperate. The Warlord's voice came over the ship's communication system. He was broadcasting to the other Krell vessels, warning them about the human. Jake listened carefully. Kreshtar described everything that had happened. The arena fights, the escape, the weeks of sabotage, the psychological terror. He warned the other ships that Jake ran through the corridors of Devastator's claw with 20 minutes left on his timer. He had memorized the route to the escape pod bay during his weeks hiding in the ship. Every turn, every door, and every checkpoint was burned into his mind. But knowing the route and successfully reaching it were two different things. The Krell had concentrated their forces near engineering when the proximity alarm sounded. Jake used this to his advantage. He moved through less guarded sections, avoiding contact whenever possible. When he did encounter warriors, he struck fast and disappeared before they could raise an alarm. A quick blow to the head with a piece of metal pipe. A tripwire made from stolen cable. Anything to slow them down without starting a full alert. 15 minutes remaining. Jake reached a major intersection and stopped. 20 Krell warriors stood between him and the escape pod bay. They were reorganizing after the arrival of the reinforcement fleet, checking weapons and receiving new orders. Going around would take too long. He had to go through them. Jake picked up a loose piece of equipment from the floor and threw it down a side corridor. The metal clattered loudly. Half the warriors turned and moved to investigate. That left 10, still too many for a direct fight, but better odds. He waited until they were distracted, then sprinted across the intersection. Low and fast. One warrior spotted him and shouted. Jake didn't stop. He fired a stolen Krell weapon behind him without looking, just to make them take cover. It worked. He turned a corner and kept running. The escape pod bay was ahead. 10 minutes left. Jake burst through the door and found 3 Krell technicians working on a damaged pod. They looked up in shock. The human was supposed to be trapped somewhere in engineering. What was he doing here? Jake didn't give them time to think. He grabbed a heavy tool from a nearby bench and swung it. The first technician went down. The second reached for a weapon. Jake kicked his legs out and brought the tool down again. The third tried to run. Jake tackled him and knocked him unconscious against the metal floor. 8 minutes. Jake checked the escape pods. Most were damaged or offline. The Krell had been using them as spare parts for other systems. Only 3 pods looked functional. Jake chose the one farthest from the door and climbed inside. The controls were designed for 4 armed Krell, but he had watched them operate similar systems during his captivity. He strapped himself into the seat and started the launch sequence. Red lights flashed. A computer voice spoke in the Krell language. warning about improper authorization. Jake ignored it and kept pressing buttons. Outside the pod, he heard shouting. Warriors had found the unconscious technicians. 5 minutes until the reactor overload. Jake needed to be far away from the ship when that happened. The launch sequence was taking too long. He bypassed the safety checks and went straight to emergency launch. The pod didn't like that. More alarms sounded. The door to the bay burst open. 40 Krell warriors flooded in, weapons ready. They saw Jake through the pod's small window. Warlord Kreshtar himself stood among them. His face twisted with rage. He had searched for this human for weeks. He had lost hundreds of warriors. His ship was falling apart, and now the human was escaping. Kreshtar raised his weapon and aimed at the pod. Jake's hand slammed down on the final launch button. The pod exploded from its dock just as Kreshtar fired. Energy beams cut through the space where the pod had been a second earlier. Jake was thrown back in his seat as the small craft rocketed away from Devastator's claw. Through the rear window, he saw the massive warship shrinking behind him. 3 minutes left on his timer. He pushed the pod's tiny engines to maximum, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the ship. At exactly 30 minutes after Jake set the timer, the plasma conduits overloaded. The explosion ripped through 3 decks of Devastator's claw. Fire erupted from hull breaches. The ship's lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in, but half the systems were offline. Warriors scrambled to escape pods and small craft, abandoning their damaged vessel. Jake watched from 2 kilometers away as the great Krell warship died. He felt no joy in it. Only exhaustion. He had survived. Against every odd, against impossible circumstances, he was still alive. But he wasn't safe yet. The escape pod was small and had limited supplies. Jake checked the systems carefully. He had oxygen for about 3 weeks if he rationed it properly. Food for maybe 10 days. Water for 2 weeks. The pod's beacon was active, sending out an emergency signal. The question was who would find him first. Jake set the pod to drift into a nearby debris field. Old destroyed ships and broken asteroids floated in a dense cloud. He could hide there while his oxygen lasted. If the Krell found him, they would kill him on sight. If the Confederation found him, well, they had already abandoned him once. He allowed himself to rest. Real rest for the first time in weeks. His body shut down into deep sleep. When he woke, the computer showed that 6 days had passed. Jake felt panic for a moment. 6 days of oxygen wasted, but his body had needed the recovery. On the 19th day in the escape pod, Jake's oxygen was running critically low. He had maybe 12 hours left. His lips were cracked from thirst. His body was weak from hunger. He lay in the pilot seat, staring at the stars through the small window, and wondered if this was how it ended. Not killed by the Krell, but slowly suffocating in a tiny metal coffin. Then the sensors beeped. A ship was approaching. Jake forced himself to sit up and check the display. It was a human vessel. The identification code showed it was the Earth ship Valiant. They had found his beacon. Relief flooded through Jake, followed immediately by suspicion. Why would Earth send a ship to rescue him? The Confederation had already written him off. Unless something had changed. Unless someone had decided that leaving human soldiers behind was unacceptable. The Valiant docked with his escape pod. Jake heard the airlock connect. The pod door opened. A tall man in an Earth military uniform stood there, surrounded by armed Marines. He looked at Jake's condition, the weeks of dirt and blood and exhaustion, and saluted. "Lieutenant Morrison, I'm Captain Ben Walker of the Valiant. We're here to bring you home." Jake tried to salute back, but his arm was too weak. "How did you find me?" "The Krell broadcast a warning about you to their fleet. Confederation listening posts picked it up. When Earth heard what happened, Ambassador Helen Price authorized our deployment. We've been searching for 3 weeks." Walker gestured to the Marines. "Get him to medical, now." They carried Jake to the Valiant's medical bay. Doctors worked on him for hours, treating infections, dehydration, and malnutrition. When Jake finally woke in a clean bed with IV lines in his arm, Captain Walker was sitting in a chair nearby. "You caused quite a situation, Lieutenant. The Krell are demanding reparations from Earth. They say you destroyed one of their warships and killed over 200 warriors." Jake's voice was rough. "They captured me after the Confederation abandoned me. The journey back to Earth took 2 weeks. Jake spent most of that time recovering in the Valiant's medical bay. His body healed slowly. The infections cleared up with proper medicine. He gained back some of the weight he had lost, but the mental scars took longer to process. Every night, Jake had dreams about the Devastator's claw. He walked through dark corridors again, hunted by Krell warriors. He woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. The ship's doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Lisa Grant, told him these reactions were normal. He had survived trauma that would break most people. His mind needed time to adjust. When the Valiant finally reached Earth, Jake stood at the viewing window and stared at his home planet. The blue and white globe floating in space looked peaceful and beautiful. He had wondered if he would ever see it again. Now that he was here, he felt strange. Part of him was still in those ventilation shafts, still fighting to survive one more day. A military transport brought him down to the surface. They landed at Earth Defense Command headquarters in Geneva. Admiral Richard Cole himself met Jake on the landing pad. The Admiral was a decorated veteran who had served in the early conflicts when humans first reached space. "Welcome home, Lieutenant Morrison," Cole said, shaking Jake's hand firmly. "You've made quite an impression on the galaxy." The debriefing lasted 3 days. Jake sat in a conference room with intelligence officers, military strategists, and civilian advisors. They asked him to describe everything again and again. They wanted every detail about Krell ship design, warrior tactics, and psychological weaknesses. Jake told them everything he could remember. What surprised him was their reaction. They weren't horrified by what he had done. They were impressed. They studied his improvised tactics like they were military genius. They analyzed his psychological warfare techniques and discussed how to train other soldiers in similar methods. On the 3rd day, Ambassador Helen Price joined the debriefing. She was a sharp woman in her 50s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes. Jake had heard about her. She was Earth's chief representative to the Confederation Council. "Lieutenant Morrison, I want you to understand something," Helen said. "Your survival has changed Earth's position in the galaxy. Before, the other species saw us as junior members who needed protection. Now, they see us as dangerous. That gives us leverage." "I just tried to stay alive," Jake replied. "And in doing so, you proved what humans are capable of." The Confederation has already changed their rescue protocols for human personnel. They won't abandon our people again, because they know we will come for them ourselves. You did that. The meeting ended with Admiral Cole offering Jake a choice. He could retire with full honors and a generous pension. No one would blame him for wanting to step away from military service after what he endured. Or he could accept a promotion and lead a new unit. "What kind of unit?" Jake asked. "Special operations. Small team tactics. Operating behind enemy lines. Doing the impossible." Cole pulled up files on a computer screen. "We're calling it the Silent Watch. You would recruit the team, train them, and lead them on missions that conventional forces can't handle. Interested?" Jake thought about it for a long moment. Part of him wanted to go home to his family, to live a quiet life away from war and violence. But another part of him, the part that had survived the Krell ship, knew he couldn't walk away. He had learned things out there, in the dark. He had discovered what humans could do when pushed to their limits. That knowledge needed to be passed on. "I'm interested," Jake said. 6 months later, Commander Jake Morrison stood in front of 12 soldiers. They were volunteers. Every one of them. The best fighters Earth had produced. They had all passed brutal selection tests. They all knew the risks. The Silent Watch would take missions that no one else would accept. They would operate alone or in small teams, deep in hostile territory, with no backup and no guarantee of rescue. Jake looked at their faces. There was Danny Fletcher, a young pilot from Texas who reminded Jake of himself 3 years ago. There was Lieutenant Amy Ross, a combat engineer who could build weapons from scrap. There was Sergeant Carlos Martinez, a hand-to-hand combat specialist who had studied fighting styles from a dozen different species. The galaxy thinks it understands humans now, Jake told his team. They've heard the stories about what happened on the Devastator's claw. Some species fear us. Some want to ally with us. Some still think we're primitives who got lucky. All of them are wrong. He walked along the line of soldiers. They don't understand that what I did wasn't special. It wasn't luck. It was human nature. When we're cornered, when we're outnumbered, when the odds say we should give up and die, that's when we're most dangerous. Because we don't quit. We adapt. We survive. We win. Jake stopped and faced the team. The Krell learned that lesson the hard way. They thought they could capture a human and play with him in their arena. They thought they were the galaxy's greatest warriors. Now their ships run when they see Earth vessels approaching. Why? Because one human showed them what we're capable of. The team stood at attention, listening carefully. These were people who had volunteered to be the sharp edge of Earth's military. They wanted to be tested. They wanted to prove themselves. Our first mission deploys in 2 weeks, Jake continued. A human colony on the Outer Rim is under siege by pirates. The Confederation declared it indefensible and ordered evacuation. But the colonists are our people. They don't want to abandon their homes. So we're going to break that siege. Lieutenant Ross raised her hand. How many pirates, sir? Intelligence says about 300, with 4 armed ships. And how many of us? 12. The team smiled. Those were the kind of odds they had signed up for. Impossible situations that required creative solutions. Danny Fletcher actually laughed. 300 to 12. Sounds fair. The mission to the colony was Jake's first test of the Silent Watch. They infiltrated the pirate fleet using captured vessels and false identification codes. Over 4 days, they sabotaged ships, eliminated leaders, and created chaos among the pirate forces. The tactics Jake had learned on the Krell warship were refined and improved with a full team. When the pirates finally realized what was happening, it was too late. Their fleet was crippled, and their command structure destroyed. The survivors scattered across 3 star systems, broadcasting warnings about human special forces who fought like ghosts. The colony was saved without a single civilian casualty. Earth's reputation grew even more. The Silent Watch became a legend. Their operators, the most feared soldiers in known space. Over the following years, Ambassador Helen Price used Earth's growing military reputation to strengthen diplomatic positions. When the Confederation Council tried to exclude humans from important decisions, she would remind them what happened when humans felt they were being treated unfairly. The reminder was usually enough. The Krell eventually signed a non-aggression pact with Earth. The treaty negotiations were tense. Warlord Kreshtar, who had survived the destruction of his ship and been demoted for his failures, attended as part of the Krell delegation. When he saw Jake Morrison across the negotiating table, now wearing an admiral's uniform, something passed between them. Not friendship or respect exactly, but acknowledgement. The warlord had learned his lesson. So had his entire species. 20 years after his capture, Admiral Jake Morrison retired from the Silent Watch. He had trained 3 generations of special operations soldiers. His tactics were studied in military academies across human space. The unit he founded had completed over 200 missions with a success rate that seemed impossible. At his retirement ceremony, Jake was asked to give a speech. He stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled military leaders, government officials, and young soldiers who saw him as a hero. When I was captured by the Krell, I was alone, Jake said. The Confederation had abandoned me. My squadron had left me behind. I had nothing but my training and my will to survive. But I learned something important in those weeks hiding in that warship. I learned that a human who fights alone is never truly alone. He paused and looked at the faces in the audience. Every human carries with them the accumulated knowledge of our entire species. Thousands of years of learning to survive, millions of people who faced impossible situations and found ways to win. When I fought the Krell, I wasn't just one man. I was using tactics developed by soldiers throughout human history. I was using psychology understood by our greatest thinkers. I was using technology created by our finest engineers. All of humanity was with me in that fight. Jake stepped away from the podium. That's what makes us dangerous. Not our ships or our weapons. Not even our courage. What makes us dangerous is that we never truly fight alone. We fight with the strength of our entire species behind us, and that's something the galaxy is still learning to understand. The ceremony ended with applause. Jake shook hands with dignitaries and posed for photographs. But later, when everything was quiet, he stood alone in his office and looked at a picture on the wall. It showed his old fighter squadron, taken before that fateful patrol 3 years into his service. Young faces smiled at the camera, unaware of what was coming. Jake thought about the lieutenant he had been back then. Naive, trusting, believing that the alliance with the Confederation made humanity safe. That version of himself had died in a Krell detention cell. What emerged was harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The galaxy had learned to fear humans. They learned that humanity didn't quit, didn't surrender, and didn't forgive abandonment. They learned that a human who fights alone was the most dangerous thing they would ever encounter, because that human fought with the fury of an entire species that had clawed its way from caves to the stars, and they would keep fighting, no matter the odds, until they won or died trying. That was what it meant to be human. NGI did was survival. I know. We all know. That's why Ambassador Price told the Krell they could file their complaint in hell. Walker smiled. Earth doesn't abandon its people anymore. Morrison, that's the new policy. You made that happen. Over the next 3 days, Jake gave his full report. Every detail of his capture, the arena fights, his escape, and the weeks of guerrilla warfare inside the Krell ship. Military intelligence officers recorded everything. They asked questions about Krell technology, tactics, and psychology. Jake answered as best he could. On the 4th day, Captain Walker came to Jake's room with news. You're being recalled to Earth for a full debriefing. But I thought you should know something. Your story has spread throughout the galaxy. Every species has heard about the human who crippled a Krell warship alone. Some are scared of us now. Some want to ally with us. Everything has changed. Jake looked out the window at the stars. He had been one abandoned soldier trying to survive. Now, he was a symbol. The question was, what Earth would do with that symbol? Ants were more dangerous than they appeared. The message was meant for the Krell fleet, but Jake realized it would be picked up by other ships in the area too. Confederation listening posts monitored these sectors. They would hear about what one human had done to an entire Krell warship. Good. Let them hear it. Let the aliens who abandoned him know what he was capable of. Let Earth know that their soldier hadn't died quietly. Jake returned to his work on the reactor controls. He finished the bypass and set a timer. In 30 minutes, the plasma conduits would overload. The explosion wouldn't destroy the ship, but it would cripple multiple decks and force an evacuation. He had 30 minutes to get to the escape pod bay, before joining the defense fleet. He understood basic principles of circuitry and power systems. More importantly, he was patient. He worked for hours, carefully peeling back layers of the panel until he could access the wiring underneath. At 3 in the morning, ship time, the guard patrols changed shifts. For 5 minutes, the corridor outside Jake's cell was empty. He had counted this timing for 3 days. 5 minutes wasn't much, but it might be enough. Jake crossed 2 specific wires in the control panel. The force field flickered and died. The cell door opened silently. He stepped into the corridor and looked both ways. Empty. He moved quickly to a service panel in the wall and climbed inside. The ventilation shafts ran throughout the Krell ship. They were large enough for the 4-armed warriors to access for repairs. That meant they were definitely large enough for a human. Jake crawled through the metal tunnels, moving away from the detention area. Behind him, alarms began to sound. The guards had discovered his empty cell. Kreshtar's voice boomed over the ship's communication system. ordering all warriors to find the human prisoner. The hunt had begun. But this time, Jake was the hunter, not the prey. He was loose in their ship with nothing to lose and every reason to cause chaos. The Krell thought they were dangerous warriors. They were about to learn what a dangerous human looked like. Etal. The force field hummed with energy. Guards walked past every few minutes, checking on prisoners. He counted their patrols, memorized their timing, and looked for any weakness he could exploit. In his mind, Jake made a promise to himself. He would not die quietly. He would not give the Krell easy entertainment. If they wanted to see what a human could do when pushed to the edge, he would show them. He would survive as long as possible. And he would make them regret ever capturing him. The galaxy was about to learn something about humans. They looked soft compared to armored warriors like the Krell. They seemed weak compared to species with natural weapons and superior strength, but humans had something else. They had adaptability. They had endurance. And when a human had nothing left to lose, when a human was pushed into a corner with no way out, that human became the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Jake Morrison was that human. The Krell just didn't know it yet.